Welcome to this afternoon's debate on what is liberalism. First of all, thanks to the Open Society Initiative for Europe and Time to Talk, who are supporting this debate as part of their Understanding the Populist Turn, the X Debate series, which is a series of debates and interviews and discussions with political figures who have changed their minds on issues and to try and understand their reasons for doing that. And I think it feels kind of more important than ever to have this conversation on a European level. Liberalism is viewed as having its kind of spiritual home in Europe, and in this sort of period of time, it's important than ever to think about what shared European values are, irrespective of membership or not of the European Union. My name's David Bowden. I'm an Associate Fellow of the Institute of Ideas and one of the organisers of the festival. The title of this session is fairly explanatory. It's part of a strand of debates where we've been looking at the changing nature of political language. And I thought it would be useful to try to understand what it is we mean when we talk about liberalism today. It was a political ideology which seemed triumphant globally from the end of the Cold War until the past year, really. Even thinking back to last year's Battle of Ideas, it was assumed that Brexit seemed like it was a strange kind of glitch and very specific to Britain. And then, of course, there would be the Clinton era in the US with a liberal Supreme Court, that there would be quite probably a centrist French government and a sort of straightforward passage of elections. And although while obviously liberalism isn't dead yet, there is obviously a lot of uncertainty around its future direction with the rise of populist and explicitly anti-liberal movements across Western and Eastern Europe, as well as in the US. And particularly we've seen in the UK an election fought between parties. Often it seemed at war with their own liberal wings and with a kind of sort of almost remarkable hostility to the idea of kind of sort of free market orthodoxy, which had held until recently. So I thought it would be a timely moment to look at what liberalism is. I'm somebody who generally hesitates to call myself a liberal as a term, but I just consider myself somebody who thinks very much in the tradition of liberal values, and I hold liberal values to be very important. So it might help me to perhaps understand why I have a nervousness about ascribing myself as a liberal. There's increasingly attacks on liberals and kind of liberal hypocrisy from the US administration at the moment, and a number of figures in the far left and on the right. And that troubles me sometimes because although I also can attack liberal hypocrisy, I also worry that sometimes the reasons why they're being criticised are not necessarily the reasons I would criticise them for. So I've kind of put together a sort of panel, all of whom to some degree would describe themselves, at least in a kind of liberal, traditional view themselves as part of that, but with very different perspectives and perhaps criticisms of that, and to try and just give us a sort of overview about what they think the term means and what the future is for it. To introduce them very briefly, speaking first to my immediate right, we have Dr. James Panton, who is head of Upper Sixth and Politics at Magdalen College School, Oxford, having previously lectured in political theory and philosophy at the university. He's a co-founder of the civil liberties campaign group, the Manifesto Club, and a regular broadcaster and writer on political and ethical issues. You may have heard him on the Malaise, where he's an occasional panellist. Next to my immediate left, although he doesn't often get described as that politically, Nick Gillespie, who's the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine and Reason TV, which is the leading voice of libertarianism in the world, really. I'm delighted to have Nick here because I always find Reason a kind of essential reading for understanding a lot of difficult liberal issues. I don't always agree with everything that it says, but it actually really always will have a fresh and very interesting take that it makes me think and engage quite closely with it. So it's great to have him on the panel. He's also a highly experienced journalist, a two-time finalist of the National Magazine Awards. And he says that he's probably the only journalist to have interviewed Ozzy Osbourne and Slash, as well as Milton Friedman. Furthest away from me on the right, we have Dr. Lukasz Pawlowski, who is managing editor and columnist for Kultura Liberalna, liberal culture in Polish. It's the leading Polish monthly liberal magazine. He has taught and studied in Indiana and Oxford, and he has won a National Bank of Poland award for his interview with Michael Sandel on economics. And then to my far left, we have Rowenna Davis, who's a secondary school teacher in Croydon, as well as a writer for publications such as The Economist, Guardian, Times, and The Sun. She's been a Labour parliamentary candidate in the past. She's also the author of the book Tangled Up in Blue, Blue Labour and the Struggle for Labour's Soul, which was looking at questions of Labour's own liberal move and where that placed it in terms of its kind of communitarian history and a sort of social democratic history. So great to have all of you on the panel. And so without much further ado, James.
Okay, thanks, David. One reason why I think answering the question of what liberalism is difficult is because, like any ideological tradition, the content of liberalism has evolved and developed over time through political conflict and historical change. So at different historical junctures, liberals have been more or less for and against the state. They've been more or less pro and anti-democracy, and they've quite likely been on both the right at sometimes and on the wrong side of lots of different political debates and arguments. The historical character of liberalism therefore means that I think insofar as there is a crisis of liberalism now, we have to understand that as a crisis of the present. And I guess what I want to do is I want to go back to some of, certainly not all of, but some of what I would take to be core liberal notions that develop historically, what I might call the ethical core of liberalism, to look at the way in which I think these are ideas and values which are increasingly under attack, but I think also undermined, because I think the attack is not always explicit. So if one thinks about the liberalism that emerges from quite a long period of social transformation 3.5 centuries ago, it's a radical and obviously at times revolutionary movement. In opposition to social hierarchy and privilege, diverse thinkers such as Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu and Tom Paine and Smith and Kant, and ultimately in the culmination of liberalism in the English tradition, John Stuart Mill, they develop different ideas that build a model of the individual and a model of society. And these ideas, I think, prioritise the notion of individual rights and freedoms as fundamental to social organisation. They prioritise a model of humanity that is universal and egalitarian in a quite important way. They create and demand a suspicion of unjustified power, not least the power of the state, and a demand that power and authority should be both subject to justification and continuously held to account. And of course they prioritise reason. We have reason over here, but I'll try and be rational too. They prioritise reason over superstition and prejudice in the organisation of our social lives. So to give a couple of examples, when Thomas Jefferson claims in the Declaration of Independence, famously, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He's making a claim to the universal equality of human beings, to a universal humanity who are equal in their capacity for freedom. Now, of course, the society that Jefferson lived in didn't reflect that fundamental insight that he had about the nature of human equality in its practical or social organisation. But what Jefferson's statement therefore does is to establish a claim, a criteria that we still, I think, need to struggle quite hard to try and bring about and to live up to. When Immanuel Kant, in his second formulation of the categorical imperative, says, always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means, what he's doing is to develop further this ethical universalism in terms of a rational foundation for recognising other individuals as like me, free, capable of autonomy, capable of rational thought, capable of self-development, and as individuals who have their own purposes in life, purposes which, as a rational being who shares a common humanity with them, I ought to respect out of a respect for my own rationality and my own humanity. What these core ideas start to do is to build a model of what it is to be a human being at this particular historical juncture, a creature capable of rational thought, with potential autonomy, with the capacity for self-development, a bearer of rights, and someone who shares in this universal human condition and human experience. And I think these are the ethical core features of liberalism, which are increasingly undermined and maligned and under attack in different ways. So let me just work through one of them, which I think is an interesting line of development to try and show you what I mean. The idea that individuals are capable of reason and thus capable of rationally making sense of the world around them and then choosing their course of action in the world poses a very radical challenge to authoritarian and paternalistic states. And just as much, it poses a challenge to each and every one of us as rational beings to work out what we think is right and to try to live accordingly. The implication of this belief in reason is a demand on the one hand for individual freedom in order to work out the kind of life that I want to lead and to work through the values that I think are right to live by. I have to live freely. I have to live free from coercion and to have the maximum amount of freedom that I can. On the other hand, it demands that I am tolerant of the decisions and the lifestyles and the beliefs that other people hold and that other people ascribe to. I think with that idea of tolerance, you can see the way in which one fundamental aspect of this kind of ethical liberal core is undermined, because for all the talk that we have of tolerance in contemporary society, I think we are profoundly intolerant. You only have to log on to social media or indeed check the Twitter feed that I imagine is expanding now as I talk and as we go on talking to discover that intolerance. But what I think is a challenge in the intolerance, an intolerance of differences of opinion, an intolerance of people who disagree with you and with your values fundamentally. I think what is being challenged there is a really important underpinning notion that individuals share a common humanity, that they share a condition in common, which is a capacity to work through arguments and to work through ideas and to come to some kind of common agreements and decisions. We often mistake, I think, tolerance for indifference. I think much of what passes for tolerance at the moment is a peculiar form of indifference. So I pretend that my indifference about who you choose to have sex with and how you choose to do it is tolerance. But in fact, what I mean is I don't care. I'm just not interested in your sex life. You can tell us about it if you like. But I think what is of moment, it might be interesting. What is of moment in this is that actually tolerance only kicks in when what you do and what you stand for is something that I find abhorrent, something that I find horrendous, something that I find challenges my values and my ideas to their very core. And so in expressing tolerance, it's very different to expressing indifference. Tolerance actually hurts, it's painful, it's something that I have to work on and achieve. I think the flip side of that, in saying that tolerance is not about indifference, is that it also involves a willingness amongst those of us who tolerate each other's profound differences to actually think that it might be important enough to work through those differences and to argue about them. So again, I don't think tolerance means that I recognise and respect what you think. I recognise and respect you as someone capable of thinking, but I actually take the ideas and the values and the principles which are at stake seriously enough to think that your ideas are worthy of criticism and challenge and robust debate. So I think just the final point I would say is that implies a certain notion of what we are as individuals, as not just people who are rational, people who are capable of making rational decisions or capable of living freely, but actually individuals who are robust enough to be capable of engaging in those kinds of rational exchanges about what is important in life. And I think in following the theme that's been going on in this room all day, you can see a number of areas which I'm sure we'll talk about, of the way in which that fundamental belief of robust individuals who share a universal or common experience as human beings is increasingly maligned, I would say, and challenged.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Nick.
Okay, and Jim had promised me last night when we slept together that he would tell everyone that he was my boyfriend now. So I was shocked by the sex life comment. But thank you very much. And actually, what he said would have saved me about 8 years of undergraduate education. I think that was about the best concise summary of liberal political theory that I've heard. And let me build on that a bit, and first by recognizing, we need to recognize that we are in a crisis, I think, of political authority, certainly in the United States, which is really the only country I know semi-well. I think it's clear in Britain as well, and actually throughout Western Europe and probably most of the OECD or developed world, where for the past couple of centuries, or since 1800, since whenever you want to kind of define the beginning of a kind of modern nation state or of a liberal political order going back to the early modern period, there's a crisis brought on by largely by political and public sector actors, elected officials, police, teachers, regulators, et cetera. In the United States, at least over the past 50 to 60 years, almost every large kind of public sector institution or set of actors, such as school teachers, such as the police, such as the courts, are at the lowest level of support or of confidence that we've seen. That's also matched in many private sector charities, the Catholic Church, a variety of other large non-state institutions that are nonetheless very important to society, civil society institutions, which have come down. The places where you don't see that, interestingly, and I'll get to this in a second, oftentimes are new economy kind of groups, such as ride-sharing apps like Uber or Lyft, Airbnb. This is where you're seeing a flourishing of confidence and trust. Because the way those systems are built, they actually prize transparency and easy transactions that are based on mutually reinforcing reputation. But in any case, what I would like to argue in this forum is that American libertarianism is essentially 21st century liberalism, and I mean that in the best sense, in that what libertarianism takes from the historic kind of understanding of liberalism, of classical liberalism, and even to a certain degree a kind of contemporary liberalism of an expanded welfare state, is that it stresses equality before the law, it strives for equality of opportunity, and it believes in pluralism and tolerance, and a robust public sphere of public debate about what are the best ways to live. And not to use coercion, but to use moral suasion and example in order to get to a place where more people are able to become their kind of maximal self. So what does American libertarianism mean? It's often confused, and this happens in the United States a lot. It gets confused with anarchism, which I think is a real problem and a misnomer. But libertarianism calls not for no government, but for clearly limited government and especially effective government policies that should be geared towards maximizing autonomy of individuals. And where we have kind of fallen apart is that we no longer do that. We have a government of massive overlapping programs that all condition any kind of aid or any kind of development of individuals in a way that gets very confusing, as opposed to, for instance, pushing for, in terms of cash transfers of benefits to people, whether it's K through 12 education or welfare or anything like that, or even healthcare. Instead of giving people unrestricted cash payments, we give people vouchers for this type of housing or this type of education, or we don't give them that at all, but we force them to go to a particular place. What U.S. contemporary libertarianism does also is it rejects the debt-financed welfare and warfare state. Do people in England use the phrase welfare and warfare state? It was popular in the late 60s, basically to attack what Lyndon Johnson called the Great Society, which meant maximizing American presence around the globe in places like Vietnam and a military buildup, as well as really maximizing the social welfare state, which I think most libertarians and most liberals would recognize as more a means of social control rather than social uplift. But we reject the debt-financed welfare and warfare state that ultimately suppresses economic growth and innovation through claims on future incomes of people even not yet born through taxes or inflation, and then stifles all sorts of lifestyle as well as commercial innovation through ever thicker and thicker layers of regulation on business. And then finally, what contemporary libertarianism does, and this I think it pulls most clearly from a kind of classical liberal tradition and kind of in the ways that Jim was talking about, it empowers individuals and groups to create what one philosopher has called a utopia of utopias. Rather, what it does, instead of being prescriptive where there is one model that is considered the best way to do things, and then people kind of get regimented or straitjacketed into that, rather by limiting the state and the scope of the state to control various aspects of our lives, of our political lives, of our commercial lives, of our economic lives, of our personal lives, it allows people to experiment or to run what John Stuart Mill called experiments in living, which we can learn from. And I like Jim's stress on the idea of arguing about different models or different experiments in living, not simply noting them and then turning away or building a higher fence. From Uber and Airbnb and Whole Foods in business, libertarianism celebrates and enables an ability to try things differently and see whether or not they flourish on how well they serve or don't serve customers, real and potential. In a cultural context, this allows us to create and produce culture on the terms that we want to set and design away from state censorship or state restrictions. Currently, streaming services and production houses for TV and movies such as HBO, Netflix, Amazon, YouTube allow for massive proliferation of all sorts of voices, all sorts of forms, and you can either watch them or not, and you can learn from them or not, and hybridize from them or not. And then finally, in the lifestyle space, what libertarianism champions are people being able to, either as individuals or as groups, to create communities, intentional communities, partial communities, totalist communities even, that they might want to try to see if they can create what I guess it was William Bradford called the shining city on the hill. He was wrong about that. Colonial Boston and Massachusetts. There's places like the Free State Project as one example of this in New Hampshire, which is a bunch of libertarians who decided to move 20,000 of them to a small state and then affect the political structure of that state and move it towards a more limited government libertarian perspective. So that's my pitch for liberalism in the 21st century is properly understood as libertarianism.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, Lukasz.
Back in the communist times in Poland, the system, the political system in Poland was called in communist newspeak people's democracy. So there was a joke back in the day, what is the difference between democracy and people's democracy? And the answer roughly the same as between a chair and an electric chair. So I think that the same applies to the difference between liberal and illiberal democracy. Because the term illiberal democracy is getting more and more popular, and it was first popularized by Farid Zakaria in his Foreign Affairs piece, The Rise of Illiberal Democracy. He wrote that from Peru to Palestinian Authority, from Sierra Leone to Slovakia, we see the rise of disturbing phenomenon, illiberal democracy. And Zakaria's piece made a to my mind, very important distinction between democracy and liberalism. Democracy, in this view, and I think that's a proper view, is a mechanism of electing political leaders. That's the way you get your authority. You just go and elect them. But to say that the state is democratic doesn't say very much about how it is actually run. It just says how you get your politicians, how you get your authorities elected. So then the liberal component kicks in. And liberal, by contrast, is about the norms, practices that shape political life. James talked about it quite a lot. So a liberal state is one in which individual rights are protected by the rule of law. It protects, this kind of state protects the individual, not only against the abuses of a tyrant, but also against the abuses of democratic majorities, because democracy can also be very illiberal. As a Bulgarian political scientist you might know, Ivan Krastev once told me, liberal democracy is a system in which you never actually win, because when you win elections there are limits to what you can actually do, but you also never actually lose, because even if you lose the elections, you're on the losing side. There are, buffers that will protect you. So you might think of liberal democracy as democracy with airbags, right? According to Zakaria, these two components, liberalism and democracy, are becoming more and more disengaged from one another, and he saw that as a real threat. Now let's jump 17 years into the future. It's the year 2014, and we are not in the United States, but in Romania. And in Romania, we are joined by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who just gave a famous speech on illiberal democracy, in which he not only said that illiberal democracy is not a threat, he said that that is actually the kind of state he wants to build in Hungary. And what he said, what is happening today in Hungary can be interpreted as an attempt of the respective political leadership to harmonize relationship between the interests of individuals and achievements of the country, the nation. meaning that Hungarian nation is not as simple as sum of individuals, but a community that needs to be organized, strengthened, and developed. And in this sense, the new state that we are building is an illiberal state, a non-liberal state. So you see, look what he's doing here. He's saying that respecting individual rights and goals makes it difficult or maybe even impossible to advance national interests. Furthermore, what he says, when those two collide, individual interests and national interests take precedence, right, should prevail. And now you need to ask yourself a question. Who defines national interests? And obviously, national interests usually are defined by the parliamentary majority, in this case, Mr. Orbán and his party. Thus, what I would like to say, without a healthy liberal component, democracy can easily turn into tyranny of what de Tocqueville called a tyranny of majority, or rather, given that the ruling parties hardly ever get the actual majority of the votes, it's the tyranny of the best organized minority. So, without this liberal component that we have in our democracies, we can easily lose what we take for granted. Political freedoms, individual rights, rule of law, kind of predictability of the state. So when somebody tells you, and there are many people apart from Orbán doing so, because let me just point out to one fact that everybody now is a Democrat. Vladimir Putin, perfectly democratic. That's what he says about himself. Orbán, Erdogan, they never say they are undemocratic, but quite often they say they are just different kind of Democrats, illiberal Democrats. They just don't want the liberal part of democracy. What I'm trying to say is that there is no democracy without this liberal part, or at least it cannot last very long. But then you can ask, does it have to be this way? Does it always have to be this way, that democracy without liberalism must turn into some form of authoritarianism? And let me get back to this joke I said at the beginning about the electric chair. Well, you can sit on an electric chair and maybe even be quite comfortable on it. But the problem is, you never really know when somebody flicks the switch on. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rowenna.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here today. I really appreciate that. And apologies for coming in a little bit late here. I wanted to make some kind of joke about, is liberalism stuck in a dark corner at the end of the Barbican? Is this the last space that it exists? Great to be here anyway. I really appreciated this great academic, theoretical, historical backdrop to this discussion. I hope what I can do is complement that by bringing a slightly more practical perspective into the mix as well. So, first of all, I feel like, I'm not sure if the rest of you do, a massive beneficiary of liberalism, not least after listening to you speak, Lukasz, and your perspective also from Eastern Europe. But growing up in North London, going to a comprehensive school where 55 languages were spoken in the playground, a lot of the time my school felt like a mini United Nations, and I was able to benefit from all of these different perspectives. And then growing up after that and being a journalist and being able to write in a place that had freedom of the press is just remarkable. And the fact that I was then after that able to be a woman in politics might not have been possible without that liberal tradition. So I really want to premise my remarks today with a huge appreciation for those values and all that it has brought me and all that it has brought us. But the central argument I want to make is ultimately one slightly of a criticism, and that is that I believe that in our society today, liberalism has got out of balance with love. What do I mean by that? Well, liberalism is a place where we have space and we have freedoms and we have rights and we have a huge space to develop ourselves as individuals. But by love, I mean perhaps communitarianism, something that pulls us closer together, while liberalism sometimes makes us feel further apart. I mean something about community, about responsibility, about loyalty, about our identity. I'm talking about our emotional connections to each other beyond our sense of individual atomized agents. And I think that part of Trump and Brexit and these moves towards illiberalism is a reaction to liberalism without love in our society. And the challenge for the modern left, certainly as I see it for Labour, is to be able to embrace love as much as it has done liberty. Working as a parliamentary candidate in Southampton Itchen, for those of you who don't know it, it's a white working class part of the south of England. We fought for 4 years there to win, and we lost. And we lost largely because people, I believe, had lost hope in liberalism. And for a lot of those people there, particularly white working class people, they didn't feel that liberals could do patriotism, for example. And for a lot of my liberal friends, patriotism remains a dirty word. You know, it's something that, you know, why on earth would you put Britain's interests before someone else's? For someone on the estate in where I was campaigning, that would be a nonsense, but for them, that's what it is. Similarly, they felt that a lot of liberals couldn't understand why they were critical of immigration, for example. And for a lot of the people that I was speaking to in Southampton, the country they viewed as a home was being viewed as liberals like a shop. It's the best analogy I can think of in that case. So a liberal might think it's fantastic that our country is really open. That means there are more customers. That means there are more people doing business with us. That means we get to meet more people. Isn't that wonderful? But for someone who views the country not like a shop but like a home, with all the emotional attachments that entails, having so many people being able to walk in and out without any sense of control is maybe a little bit more frightening and maybe a little bit more threatening to the concept of a home and an emotional place. Similarly, a liberal can, I think, end up walking far too far down a completely blanket free market path. And it was interesting what you said, Nick, about, you know, the rise of Airbnb and Uber, and we can debate about the merits of those individual things, and there's no doubt they brought a lot of great things to probably people in this room and beyond, but they can't be replacements to that sense of practical, face-to-face, concrete community that these people are living with. And for a lot of places in Southampton like that, you know, the decline in the industry there in manufacturing and shipbuilding can't just be then replaced with these new kind of liberal high-tech solutions that give them more consumer benefits, because their lives still feel like they lack meaning, like they lack belonging, like they lack purpose. And the answer surely has to be to regenerate those institutions as well as to provide new ones. I think perhaps the biggest thing that liberals without love fail to understand is that for many people, change has not been a positive, productive thing in their lives. You know, if you grew up a generation ago in Southampton, you would have been able to get a great apprenticeship, get a job in the docks, raise enough money to look after your family, buy a house, and, you know, live well. Not be a millionaire, but live well. And now, if you grow up in Weston or those parts of Southampton, you know, and I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about Southampton as representative of many places across the country, you can't do that in the way that you used to. And maybe now what you're doing is you're working in Costa Coffee on a 0-hour contract with no prospects of necessarily improving yourself in the way that you were. So I think liberals view change as progressive and always positive, whereas for a lot of those people out there, preservation of and sanctity and loyalty and protection of some of those things you hold dear are really, really important. And so I just conclude by saying that to really to understand and to protect liberalism in the long run, we are going to need to do love better at the same time. Because just as liberalism pulls us apart, sometimes love can bring us back together. And until we understand that, the left won't regenerate in the way that it needs to, and liberalism is under threat.
Now, guaranteed that I've now got Phil Ox's "Love Me, I'm a Liberal" stuck in my head for the rest of the debate, so thank you, Rowenna. I'm just going to go straight out to the audience to see if you've got any points or questions.
Hi, Jim. You mentioned that tolerance is often confused with indifference. I would say rather that it's confused with politeness, or being nice, or indeed love. And this isn't what tolerance demands, is it? Liberals know this. Tolerance includes and involves sometimes very harsh argument, vigorous argument, satire, things that might hurt people's feelings but not hurt them. It's intolerant people who kill and censor those who they disagree with. So when we try to make laws that ban offensive speech, things that might offend, let's say, Muslims or indeed Islamists, you're not protecting moderate Muslims at all, or tolerant Muslims. The only ones you're protecting are completely intolerant Muslims. Which brings me to Lukasz's point. He says, given the future potential that mass immigration could lead to democracy being the means by which Islamists could, let's say, potentially use democracy to overthrow liberal values, I'm really curious at your choice of examples that you chose to talk about Hungary instead of Turkey. And so finally, Oriana, communitarianism is not liberalism at all, because liberalism gives primacy to the individual as a rational agent, not as someone whose role is shaped by obligations to family or community or church or religion. And everyone knows that.
Yeah, really fantastic speeches. I really enjoyed each of them. I was very interested that throughout each of your different speeches, there seems to be a key theme running through each of them. So, Jim, you seem to have tolerance as central to yours. Nick, you seem to have equality. Lukasz, you seem to have democracy. And Rowenna, you seem to have communitarianism. So I just wondered, in terms of your plan to revive 21st century liberalism, can you argue for yours over the others? Why should yours prevail over the others?
And I just wondered to what extent, if anybody thought that the kind of analogy between Brexit and a kind of reversal of liberalism is actually overdone, and whether or not really it's just, it's a bit of a storm in a teacup. And I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that.
I was just wondering the opposition between liberalism and democracy. I don't think it applies. If you say that democracy can be the tyranny of the majority, I think it's very important to point out that the tyranny of the majority is no more a democracy than the tyranny of one man. If you have the tyranny of a majority, then the minority, who are part of the citizenry, part of the demos, are being treated as less equal than the citizens contained in the majority. Hence, democracy falls apart. The essence of democracy is like playing a game. 3 individuals come together, like, let's say, 100 of them come together. They wish to decide whether to leave the EU or any other kind of collective decision. And they say the only fair way to do this in a community of equals is to let the greater number of equals prevail. And then they agree at a certain date to make a decision and beforehand debate it. And then the winner wins. And that's not oppressive. That's just how you make decisions in a free society. So I don't get that at all.
Yes, thanks a lot. I guess I'm kind of going to pick up on the communitarian point to make a similar one, which is, and I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but this is pretty much the main sort of criticism of liberalism, is that it's a little bit passive, essentially, that there's no... it assumes that everyone, I think it was said here, each person is a sort of rational agent able to maximise their own welfare, but it doesn't really talk about those, I guess, people who are more disadvantaged for whatever reason, who aren't really able to participate fully in the game. And I think that's probably the main, or it seems to be the main sort of criticism of liberalism as sort of put forward classically by some of the panelists. Thanks.
Okay, James, do you want to?
My response to the problem, I'm an ambivalent liberal in the sense that I think liberalism has some very good ideas and some very core ethical principles, and then it also has some more problematic ideas. And I think one aspect where that's revealed is actually in the context of liberal democracy, because insofar as by liberal democracy we mean a democracy which guarantees a basic rule of law and basic foundational rights as the condition of us all being able to coexist and work together, I think those things are very important. I think very often, though, what passes in the current discussion, and certainly in the academic discussion, we had some of this in the last debate on democracy earlier today, is actually a very undemocratic liberal model, which is premised upon the idea that actually people are not really very good at making decisions. They're not really very smart. They're not really very capable of making important decisions. And I think you can see that in terms of things like the response to Brexit, where clearly, and this is the problem with a particular liberal mindset, the people made the wrong decision, didn't they? So they were given the opportunity to choose, and they misunderstood the complexity. So the liberal democratic model that I think many people ascribe to is, well, if only we'd taught them enough and told them enough about the complexity of the situations, they could have got the decision right. I think that's hugely problematic. So I think I just want to say there's a tension there. And when it comes to the debate between liberalism and democracy, I think I'm a Democrat first and foremost who wants to instill certain liberal principles within there. I think that's also for me the difficult tension with communitarianism, because communitarianism has the potential to be hugely coercive. That's its problem, isn't it? I agree with Rowenna, and I think most of us would agree, the society that we live in is problematically atomistic and alienated and individuated in lots of ways, where we see communities that really don't come together. And I want those communities to come together. For me, the way in which those communities generate themselves is not by us recognising them as they are, but it's by actually having a society that can encourage people to come together and work through what it is that they want to do and what it is that they want to value. That's not a process that can come from the top. That's not really a process that we can facilitate through the state. On the contrary, that's a process that I think comes about through generating a culture of, a universal desire for engagement, but also encouraging people to take a position in their life which is a bit more robust about what they're capable of. So I think I would call in that, on Rena's concern, not so much for love. I like love, ask Nick, but not so much for love, but actually for democracy. Thank you. That's 2 compliments today. I like that. But the democratic engagement therefore becomes the important bit. Whether we end up loving each other, might happen, might not. But we're going to end up working together and forging communities together.
Okay, Nick, is there anything you want to pick up?
Yeah, sure. One of the things I would say is that to put this in kind of contemporary political terms, what we're looking at, certainly in the United States, and I suspect in England as well, and again, most of Western Europe, or most of Europe, is that we have a political system that is very much liberal. We all believe that government should be limited. And that democracy, contrary to what the audience member said, you can't have 51% out of 100 polity of 100 people. You can't have 51% or 51 people say, okay, we're taking everything from the other 49, including their lives. Like, there are limits to what we think of as proper government or as legitimate government, and that's a liberal project that puts limits on democracy, as was stated before. But what we're looking at here is the bankrupting, literally and figuratively, of large-scale, big government liberal programs. In America, for instance, the poor parts of the country, the inner cities, they don't suffer from a lack of government attention. They don't suffer from a lack of government resources. What they suffer from consistently are institutions that force them to stay in a particular place that are incredibly destructive to their lives. They have schools that spend more and more money each year that teach people less and less. They give them less abilities to actually fulfill their capacity, their capabilities. They labor under all sorts of business regulations, all sorts of zoning codes, all sorts of coercive relationships that they can't get out of. And I think what I call for in a kind of 21st century liberalism as libertarianism is not to say, okay, the state should be completely out of education. We can make an argument for that, but rather that you give people more options that are closer to what they want, because we need to, if we want to be serious and if we want to treat people with respect, which I think is a precondition for love, is to say, that a parent of an inner city school child actually has more understanding and more the fierce urgency of now to say, I want my kid to be going to a school that will help them become a better person, who will be able to get a job, who will be able to start a business that is different. And that goes, and I'm thinking, I don't know anything really about England, but in the Rust Belt, they talk about deindustrialization. America, and I suspect Britain is somewhat similar, the percentage of people in the industrial economy in the United States as a percentage of the labor force peaked in 1943. I went to graduate school in Buffalo in the early 90s. Buffalo as a city peaked in population and in jobs and in economic power in 1950. People were still talking about, 10 years ago you could have a factory job there. It wasn't really true, and we need to give people the ability to move on and to morph into something different. And we need to do that by having the government do fewer things. We all recognize now you don't need the government to run an airline or to run a train or all sorts of things. The private sector will develop those, get the government out of that, and then allow for a more efficient, actual use of government pooled resources to help people become who they might be.
Lukasz, as a kind of traditional liberal, is this kind of j'accuse all of these comments? Or?
No. That's basically the point, that liberalism puts limits on the kind of decisions you can take democratically, because Brexit is a clear example. That the majority voted, you agreed on the procedure, the decision is taken, you should follow it. So whether I think it's a good or bad decision doesn't really matter. But there are obviously obvious limits to that. If, for example, those who won this vote decided to the Remainers should not be granted civil rights anymore because they have a different opinion, that would be going too far, even if the decision was taken democratically. And the same goes. Obviously, there are very examples of many situations in which it is contestable. For example, only recently, the Catalan Referendum. Should you follow the democratic decision of the Catalan people, or should you respect the individual rights of all those people who voted against or were not taken into consideration when the vote was taken because they live in different parts of Spain? The same goes, for example, in the United States. Should former prisoners be deprived of their civic rights? You can take this decision democratically. We agree that those people who spent, let's say, 5 or more years in jail should never regain their civil rights. It's a democratically taken decision, but is it right, and is it in accordance with liberal democracy? I would say no. So I agree. Liberals put limits on democracy. That causes tension because you always have to kind of negotiate which decision can be taken democratically and maybe which should be somehow left aside because that would be going too far. One way of overcoming it is introducing qualified majorities. That some decisions should be taken by a not plurality of the votes, but clear majority or some supermajority of the votes. So there is also always tension, but just to say, let's be democratic and get rid of liberalism is in the long run will cause more trouble than bring benefits. That was my argument.
Okay, Jim just wants to jump in some quickly there.
I was just going to say, I think the best response to the tyranny of the majority is more debate, more engagement, more argument, more criticism. You hold the ideas of the majority to account through more democracy and more discussion and more argument and more contestation, and you try and win people over. Now, I don't think that means we don't need a basic framework of rights. I can go with that. But what I'm getting at is that I think at the moment our tendency is to think that just because we've got a majority that we don't agree with, then that's the end point, isn't it? And actually the whole process of democratic engagement is one of making decisions, and those decisions have to be made by a majority. And yes, actually by a majority of 50% plus a tiny bit, and that's what a majority is. But then we keep on going with those debates and those arguments and those discussions. But we have made the decision on Brexit. The people who didn't want, and I know that's not what you're saying, but the people who didn't want to go with Brexit can carry on campaigning. They have to carry on campaigning and making their argument. But they lost an important decision that's been made.
I agree with that. What I would say to that is there are some decisions that are irreversible, and they irreversibly change your political system, and you cannot really get back, because once you deprive some people of the right to speak or to actually deprive them of political rights, you can't really take that back. So again, there is a tension. My point is as simple as that. When somebody is trying to sell you this narrative that there is some kind of different democracy, a liberal democracy, just don't buy it. We may argue what should be the limits of the liberal protections against democratic decisions, what should be the extent of protection to individual rights, but just don't buy this narrative that you can have a liberal democracy. In my mind, you can't.
Okay, Rowenna?
Great, thank you. I just wanted to thank the lady at the back because you're helping me clarify a really important point. So in my speech, I wasn't trying to say that liberalism is communitarianism. I was trying to say that liberalism is nicely counterbalanced by a different positive force, which is love or communitarianism, however you might see that. And actually, you shouldn't have too much of one without the other. Both provide checks on the other becoming slightly out of hand. And what I would argue about our current society is that we have a massive surplus of liberalism compared to love, compared to communitarianism. There is very little space in our political life at the moment for the values of faith or family or flag. And actually, when I say those words, sometimes in a very liberal audience, they can sound like nasty or negative or perhaps dangerous words. And the problem is that when we see those words as something negative, another group like UKIP or like the BNP or like many far-right groups in Europe will step in and fill that space. They'll say, we can provide that communitarian values for you. We can provide a home for these things that the mainstream is not providing. And then we get into a very dangerous situation where liberalism is perhaps under threat because it hasn't understood those concerns. Saying that is not saying that I think the state should run more things. And if you have a look at Blue Labour, you can talk about lots of ways in which the state can help organise things to facilitate more community action. You can look at the massive history of mutuals or cooperatives or the third model or vocational education or apprenticeships to kind of see how you can be more participatory in your state, and it doesn't have to be a centralised form of engagement at all. I just want to finish off by just answering the gentleman at the back by saying, is this all overblown? I don't think so. A lot of the time, liberal values have for a long time really looked down on people who are different. I think this speaks to James's point as well. Around Brexit, there was a joke going around in our staff room that people without a degree shouldn't be able to vote. Oh, they shouldn't be allowed to vote, should they? They're all ignorant. And it made me think of something that Maurice Glassman says, who's a great hero of mine, who said, no one is more intolerant than the people who keep going on about tolerance. Right? And I think there is something to that. How liberal are we when we are looking at a Brexit voter or someone who voted for Trump? Do we just dismiss them as irrational? Are we really just criticising their views, or are we actually undermining them as people? And I think until we respect them truly as people, we are in danger of undermining our very own liberalism that we claim to protect.
So I'll go back out to the audience.
One of the values of liberalism that you talked about was that of rationality. Now, we know that it's fairly common for people to be irrational. So do you regard irrationality as a moral failing? If so, what does one do about it when one sees it? And if not, how is it logically possible for anything to be moral failing?
So this is a strand on the crisis of political language, and I wondered if any of you'd like to comment on, the dreaded liberal elite who are demonstrably illiberal, who hate free speech, who are intolerant, and who want to dictate how people should live their lives. Second point is, Lukasz, the sort of checks and balances that you're talking about make me really nervous. And because ultimately all of these checks are checks on the people. They are checks on our right to elect a government of our choosing, whether liberal or illiberal. And, I wonder if that is an expression of a lack of faith in the liberal project? That, people do often contrast it to democracy. Is there a belief that people can't be won over to liberalism, that it should just be an elite thing that should just be decided and in place constitutionally, so the buggers out there can't fiddle with it too much?
I used to belong to the Green Party. I was a reliable leaflet deliverer for the Green Party. Going to Green Party meetings was like going to a student political meeting. There was no great connection between you and the other people, but you thought you were doing a useful job. I left when Caroline Lukasz said, I want open borders as soon as possible. I then joined UKIP. Joining UKIP, walking in there to the first meeting, surrounded by people who knew very little about all the things we've been discussing so far, I felt a warmth and a connection which I had not felt before. And if we agree that rationality is driven by emotion, my decision to join UKIP and to work for it has been right.
No one said the Battle of Ideas doesn't have a plural audience. It's quite a journey.
One of the themes of classical liberalism was actually the free market, and it was interesting that none of you
focused on that aspect of liberalism at all. Interestingly, Nick started to mention the economy for the first time in part of his answer, and perhaps that's from an American perspective. Has that aspect of liberalism essentially been killed off? I mean, very few people today defend the free market at all, and indeed the term neoliberalism is more or less spat out by most sort of commentators in the sense that this just reveals a kind of complete disdain for the free market. Is that aspect of liberalism dead?
First of all, Lukasz, as a follow Paul, actually a second-generation Paul, and I, as someone who voted for Brexit, also actually as someone, a member of UKIP, and Rowenna, I mean, far right. With respect, I mean, if you're going to engage with people in your community in Southampton, Itchen, and in a non-patronising way, it's probably not useful to use those terms. I do agree with actually a lot of the points you made, Rowenna, because you were talking about communitarianism, and I agree with the panel, it needs to be civic rather than state, it needs to be organic from the individual rather than top-down. There's an author called Robert Putnam, who was an advisor to Bill Clinton in the 90s, who wrote a book about 15 years ago called Bowling Alone, and it was all about the demise of the bowling leagues in the States and how civic communitarianism, participation within groups, had declined. I actually think that that's, we've now seen a counterbalance to that with the rise of social media, with the rise of the internet, and actually people, it's a lot easier now to come together and to sort of interact both politically and socially. Lukasz, I think it's very important to make this point. You cannot put restrictions on democracy and claim to be liberal by putting any kind of restrictions on democracy that is by its very nature illiberal. Right, and I need to make that point extremely strongly. One other thing I wanted to say, the author Douglas Murray made a very good point. Today, there are people who are somewheres and anywheres. The somewheres are the working class, the people for whom communities are extraordinarily important, almost an extension of themselves. And there's the anywheres, the liberals, the sort of middle classes who think, well, as long as I can go and travel freely anywhere in Europe, that's fine. And I think that goes down to self-confidence and self-belief. It's the traditional working classes who perhaps don't have that self-confidence, who need it, who need those communities. And I think it's very important to reconnect liberalism with patriotism.
So it was mentioned that liberalism requires tolerance. However, as many people have argued, such as Karl Popper, tolerating the intolerant leads to the destruction of tolerance itself. And so considering that, how far do the panel think that liberal societies can afford to tolerate the intolerant?
When the four of you were speaking, I was thinking how I agreed with all of you. And then I thought, well, that can't be right. And I've just realised, actually, after hearing our Green stroke UKIP speaker, why it is. I think it's because you were all speaking at quite an abstract level. And the problem always comes when you try and apply abstract principles to practical problems. And to me, that the solution to these problems is to have a proper balance between theory and practice. And that's why I agree very much with Jim, that actually democracy has always got to come first, and you then inject that democracy with values and principles. And I think one of the problems we have in society at the moment is that mix between theory and practice is always out of step. I think with someone like Trump and also with UKIP, they're very good on practice. They go and talk to people, they know what people think and how they feel, but they don't have liberal theories to back them up. Whereas the prevailing discourse, which of course Trump and UKIP are reacting against, is very heavy on theory. I mean, it's not high theory, it's not particularly well thought out, but it's always informed with notions of vulnerability, multiculturalism, diversity, all of that bollocks. But it is a theory which no one feels able to challenge. And I think the way to do it is by having a proper mixture between theory and practice.
Thank you. Rowenna, you were talking about, I think, illiberal liberals when you were, part of your critique was about illiberal liberals, and I completely agree with that. But one of the really exciting things that happened in this country back in the summer of 2016 was waking up, well, actually sitting there watching it all night long and watching the Brexit vote. Because people have been told by liberals, they have been poured upon them from every possible outlet how stupid you would be to vote for Brexit. And I didn't think they would do it. I thought, it's going to be quite close, but they're not going to do it. And then bloody hell they did. And that was the most exciting day I can remember, to go to work and to talk to other teachers who hated the decision, absolutely hated the decision, but have a debate and discussion about it. It was just marvellous. But then you've spoken about a lack of purpose in people's lives and a lack of sense of how they can move forward. And I think that's perhaps one of the things that's missing from this debate. You've all touched on it in some way, but not taken it anywhere. And Nick, I was really interested in your comment about experiments in living in America. And I like that idea. I like that sort of let many flowers bloom. But in the context that we're talking about, is that really going to bring about the change that we need? Because actually people's lives are dominated non-stop, as you've said, by being told what to do and how to live their lives. So is experiments in living enough to rescue us from this situation?
The morning of the Brexit vote starting in our school, there was this rumour going around, oh, miss, they're never going to let Brexit go through, miss. They're never going to let Brexit go through. That's why you have to vote in pencil, miss, because otherwise, they're going to change the vote. And I remember thinking when that Brexit vote came through, I am so glad it was not a narrow Remain. Because actually, what I think happened was that democracy ended up being a sufficient vent for people's genuine anger. And if we hadn't taken that anger off the pressure cooker through our democratic system, I think in 5 years we could be electing a highly right-wing government. And in a sense, people realised that if they voted, they made a difference. And many people might be unhappy with that, but at least the democratic system was able to take that anger and channel it rather than forcing it underground or it coming back to haunt you in a much worse way later.
Karl Popper, the author of The Open Society and Its Enemies, was known by his students and colleagues. They referred to that book as The Open Society by one of its enemies, because he was quite a jerk and intolerant in personal life. But to talk about free markets and the role of that and in experiments in living, this is where I think we need a rescission of the state. We already can't afford it. Financing current government through massive sustained debt. Virtually all economists agree that that slows down economic growth substantially. And what we've been seeing in the developed world over the past 15 or 20 years is exactly that. Whereas the United States has a national debt that is equal to more than 100% of its annual GDP, we have struggled to get above 1-2% in economic growth, which ends up eroding standards of living over time for a variety of reasons, and it freezes economic innovation in many ways, not completely. And this is where I'll go back to the question about the free market. What we see in areas where people are able to innovate and experiment, we see a flourishing of free market activity that is leading to new jobs and economic revitalization in various parts of the country. And so it's not a mistake that in states in the U.S. like Florida and Texas, which tend to be have less restrictions on how long or how difficult it is to start a business, to staff a business, to permit a business, you see higher rates of economic growth, and that's where people are moving. And in many ways, in the United States, it would be great if we actually paid for our government or we limited our spending to what we raise in taxes. And we probably, if we gave everybody a voucher or unrestricted cash grants, so that if you're living in Buffalo, New York, you can take a bus and get an apartment in Florida or Texas. You'd be much better off than trying to endlessly reprime these economies, which just don't seem to be working whatsoever.
Jim? Yeah, I mean, I think more experimentation is just always a good thing. I think the more freedom we have to experiment more in our lives, I think at the moment, certainly economically, with different models of economic development and business, I think that's great. I mean, I'm quite inspired by some of what Nick says. I'm probably not as optimistic that that's actually the direction that everything is going in. So I think more experimentation could be good. I think at the same time as you've got some of those kind of, I think of it as kind of Californian, sort of, do you know what I mean, model, the startup model of that. You've got that going on. So you've got certain sectors of the economy where things are happening that might be quite interesting. I think you've also got what I think, my understanding when people talk about this problematic neoliberal system, my understanding of this neoliberal system is not that it's liberal, it's that it's profoundly anti-liberal. I don't think it's particularly free market. I think it's a kind of structure of economic and social organisation that is quite happy to keep muddling along because nothing is putting it under pressure. I think it doesn't develop very well. I don't think it develops particularly well at the economic growth and development and the kind of things that could be liberating, potentially, about a more freer and experimental economic system. And I think there's very little pressure on that. I think you can see what happens when pressure is put upon that system, and that's where I see something about Brexit. And I hate to be a conspiracy theorist, but they're never going to let it happen. It's not going to happen. I think somebody said earlier on today, we're going to leave the EU in the form of not leaving the EU, and I think that's the reality. We're going to fudge the whole thing. So actually, they're not going to let it happen. And that's where you see democracy being fundamentally undermined.
Lukasz?
Yeah, I'd like to address the questions that I got from here and from over there, that when you try to limit the scope of what can be decided democratically, you cannot call yourself a liberal, and it's basically illiberal position. Then let me throw it back to you. Would you ban Supreme Court? It's a highly undemocratic institution, which sometimes overrules the will of the people. Many people may be in favor of restoring the death penalty, but the Supreme Court can say that, for not in the United States, but in any other countries, that it's against Constitution, we should not change it. Constitution, again, a highly undemocratic tool, because usually it's very difficult to change it, especially, for example, in the United States. Again, another example from the United States. Let's say after the Civil War, if you followed the voice of the people in the South, they would restore slavery immediately. Should you allow to do it, or should you somehow limit their ability to make that decision? That's, I would say you should, because it infringes upon other people's rights. In his famous essay on liberty, John Stuart Mill says that the freedom of one man ends where the freedom of the other begins. So that's my position, and I don't think that if you limit the scope of the decision that can be taken in a political system, that necessarily makes you not liberal. And I understand that maybe we went too far. This is another subject into a kind of political correctness, into what is admissible to political debate, and that caused a great deal of frustration, which we could see in the Brexit referendum. But I would also argue, I'm not British, so maybe you'll take it as an offense, but you keep on saying that the elites voted Remain or urged people to vote Remain. Well, 48% of the people voted Remain. It's a pretty big political elite that you have here, I would say so. That's all. It's no, don't put it in such a binary terms that it's political elite on the one side and the people on the other, because there were pretty much, the same number of the people on the other side.
What are the panel's sources of hope for the future of liberalism?
You just mentioned John Stuart Mill and the whole harm principle, but when we're talking about rationality and irrationality, John Stuart Mill believed slaves and black people were barbaric, so they couldn't rationally come to the decision of making a good decision. So when do we actually consider what makes a person rational without being discriminatory or subjective?
The main premise of liberalism is that of the individual rational agent, as you mentioned. So sometimes, although I believe everybody in his own mind is rational and he makes sense, sometimes we make decisions which are against ourselves and are harmful to ourselves. So my question is, how does liberalism tackle a very challenging situation in which a critical mass of people, for whatever reason, make decisions that are bad for themselves, and therefore, as a society, as a whole, we take a harmful path?
Rowenna.
In answer to that question there, I think liberalism demands that we let people harm themselves to a certain degree. I mean, if people make a decision that you feel is the wrong one, you've got to let them learn from it, grow from it, and carry on. Even Nigel Farage said at the time of Brexit, there might be a big economic cost to pay, but it's worth it because we feel other things are important. So you've got to let people do that. In terms of sources of hope, I would say that when I go in and to my classroom and see my kids and they ask really difficult questions, I remain really hopeful about the future and of liberalism.
Brilliant. Lukasz?
Oh, right. So I'll try to answer that question. Well, it's hard for me to defend the racist views of the people who lived 200, 250 years ago. And obviously you can say the same about founding fathers in the United States, who counted every black person as 3/5 of a person. So this is a matter from another discussion, whether you can disengage political views from the kind of some political views from the others, which we now find unacceptable. So now what I think is the dominant, obviously, position is that every adult person is rational, is capable of making their own decisions, and that's what we should stick to. It's as simple as that. Whether we consider that rational or emotional doesn't really matter. People are also entitled to make emotional political decisions, and I presume they usually make emotional decisions as far as politics are concerned.
Nick?
Yeah, I'll talk about optimism. I am always super optimistic in every part of my life, and I suspect everybody here, that is not governed directly or heavily controlled indirectly by politics. Things continue to get better, more fair, more accessible, and more interesting. My phone keeps getting better. My internet keeps getting better. The movies, the TV shows I can get, the videos I can make as a professional get better and better all of the time. My lifestyle, I've never been so free. My grandparents came to America about 100 years ago. They had very little freedoms, either politically because they were immigrants, but just economically and just on a lived experience basis. I and my children have, are able to do all sorts of things, and that is a almost universal experience in the United States. So for me, the optimism is looking in the places beyond politics where people are able to actually come together in a true community, where it's a win-win, a kind of market-based situation. And what we need to do is maximize the space where that type of voluntarism and cooperation can come together.
And Jim?
Just on Mill, Mill actually talked about the people who weren't capable of freedom being children and barbarians. You might think he's a bit of a 19th century elitist, because he was, but the interesting thing about both the children and barbarians is he thought they were all potentially capable of freedom. It's just that under certain social conditions they couldn't live freely. He didn't say anything about black people or indeed about slaves. His point was about the nature of social organisation and whether that made freedom possible. Maybe I'll just end with Mill in terms of my moment of optimism. Mill's kind of criteria about harm, I think, is really interesting, because he wants us not to harm each other, and then people often say, well, he doesn't tell us what harm is. But actually he does, he's very clear. He says harm is harm to the permanent interests of mankind as a progressive being. And I think that's an aspect of liberalism that I think is hugely important. That notion of mankind as a progressive being, that notion of all of us as being capable of transforming ourselves and taking ourselves forward, and that actually the limits that we want to impose upon each other are as thin as those limits which prevent us preventing that possibility of social development and further social engagement with each other.
Excellent. Can we thank the panel?